Mandy Richards. 2-year-old Mandy came from Llandiffer in Wales, and one day the family went on a long drive to Norfolk in southeast England to visit her auntie. Her auntie lived in Harleston in Norfolk, and the family had never before visited the area. As the family arrived in Harleston, Mandy became extremely excited and pointed to an old broken down shack with a black tarmac roof. Then Mandy exclaimed, "Look, Mummy, that's where the old man made all the rings. I used to watch him through the window around the back." Her mother, Sybil, then asked her daughter, "When did this happen? Because we have never been to this town before." She then said to her daughter, "Are you sure you're not thinking about something you saw in one of your picture books?" "No, Mummy, it was a real man, and I used to watch him through the window, and he was a funny old man with a hammer. I saw him when I lived before, and I used to look at him through the back window." It was at this stage that her father had started to listen to what his daughter was saying, and asked, "Mandy, how could you have lived before?" She then said to her father, "Oh, I have lived before, and I remember it. I lived near here, and I used to play around the hut with my sister." Then Mandy continued, "I had a sister called Sarah, who was a few years older than me, but unfortunately she could remember her sister's name, but not her own name." Mandy said that when she played around the hut with her sister, she would lift her up so she could see through the window. Mandy also added that the lower part of the window was cloudy and she couldn't see through it, so her sister Sarah would lift her up to enable her to see through the top part that was clear. She said that when she looked through the window, the old man just ignored her and carried on working. She described the man as having grey hair with a big bushy moustache, and he wore thin-rimmed glasses with very small glasses on them which sat at the end of his nose, and he used to look down through the small glasses at the work he was doing at the workbench. Her mother then asked Mandy what else she remembers as she looked through the window. She said that the old man would bang wildly at pieces of silver with an odd-shaped hammer, and said that there were also other women working with him in the shack, and they all did something to the rings. One lady's job was to place the rings in boxes and then wrap them up in brown paper. On another occasion, when they were visiting the area, Mother asked her husband to stop the car as she wanted to look inside the shack to see if her daughter was telling the truth or whether it was just her wild imagination. They both then got out of the car and walked to the back of the old shack, and there definitely was a window just as her daughter had described. The window had old frosted glass at the bottom and clear glass at the top. Again, it was exactly as her daughter had described. The window was protected by rusty iron bars. As Sybil peered through the window, she could see old junk, along with cobwebs and dust. Her parents were so intrigued at what their daughter had described that they decided to do further research and check out some old records at the local census office in Norwich. They were able to trace some records back to the year 1868 and found that a silversmith had once operated just outside Harleston and documented houses and huts that were close to the railway line. They found that the name of this silversmith was a man called Mr. Michael Mothersole, who operated a business from a place very close to where the road crossed by the railway line next to an old iron bridge. What amazed Mandy's parents was that the location of the silversmith was in the exact location to where their daughter had first described seeing the old man working. Was this absolute proof that their daughter had once lived a life as a young girl, sometime in the 1860s in Harleston, a place she had never ever been to in this life? Simon Brown. The following story took place in Australia. It is about a young boy called Simon Brown. As soon as Simon could talk and hold a conversation, he said to his mother Susan, "I've been here before and was on a big boat with sails and lots of ropes, and I fell into the water. I died when I fell into the water." Susan then asked her son to tell her more about his other life. Simon said there was a fierce storm and he fell overboard, along with his dog, who was always with him. Simon then went on to describe the boat in more detail, where it had huge sails, 3 masts and hundreds of ropes. The boat was steered by a huge wheel with spokes all around it. He then went into more detail about his drowning and calmly described how everything went black when he went under the waves and was very quiet. After a period of time, he suddenly woke up and his dog was at his side. They were in a very bright place, but he said he was very tired and went back to sleep again. After that moment, he did not remember anything else until he was born again and saw Susan and Greg as his new mummy and daddy. On one occasion, Simon accidentally knocked over a jar of freshly made jam, where it crashed to the floor and broke. He then looked sheepishly at his mother and said, "I hope I don't have to do haze now." When I was a sailor, I hated doing haze, but on occasions I had to do it. His mother asked him what he meant by haze. Simon replied, it happened if you were naughty, where you had to scrub all the decks as well as other work. Susan then mentioned Simon's story to her husband Greg, and the incident had almost been forgotten until one night they had a friend over to dinner called Peter Rawlings. Peter had once been a merchant seaman who had emigrated to Australia many years before. Peter had never met their son Simon. Over dinner, the conversation eventually came around to talking about ships and the sea, so Greg took the opportunity to ask his friend whether he'd ever heard of the word haze. Peter replied, of course I have, and every sailor has heard the word haze. It's extra work given on board a ship as punishment. Later on, Simon would describe to his parents the places that he'd visited when he was a sailor and gave vivid mental descriptions of landing on an island with lots of trees, flowers and fruit. He described the landscape as being lush and the weather was very hot. Simon was asked whether he had met the people on the island, and he replied, lots and lots. The people didn't wear many clothes, and they were very colourful with lots of beads. He was asked whether he spoke to the people, and he said, well, they tried to talk to us, but we couldn't understand each other, so we did not know what we were saying. He spoke funny and gave us gifts. How could a young boy at such a young age, that could not yet read or write, describe in vivid detail a life he had once lived as a sailor that possibly lived sometime in the 18th or 19th century, judging by his description of the sailing ship that he once sailed on and drowned in that life? If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Philip Harding. Philip was only 2.5 years of age when he went to Oxford, England with his Aunt Rosemary. At such a young age, Philip had never been to Oxford, and if he had, he would have been too young to have observed anything that would have had any meaning. His Aunt Rosemary had only fleetingly been through on a coach, so neither would have had any knowledge of the ancient town. They had not been in the town very long when Philip asked his auntie whether they could visit the funny clock. She looked at him in a confused manner and said, "What funny clock?" Philip then went on to describe a large clock at the side of a church that had strange markings on its face. As his auntie had no idea what her nephew was talking about, she tried to change the subject by suggesting that they each get an ice cream and sweets while they were shopping. However, Philip was insistent, and his auntie had to admit that she had no idea where the church with the funny clock was. Then his auntie was totally surprised when Philip said, "Well, I know where it is, and I'll show you." Then Philip grabbed his auntie's hands and proceeded to guide her down back alleys and side streets, and all of a sudden, in front of her was a huge clock face. She then asked Philip how he knew about the clock face, and more surprisingly, knew exactly where it was. His response startled her even further, when he replied that he'd once lived here as a little boy called Andrew. 1 year later, his Aunt Rosemary was babysitting him, and he surprised her again by stating that, "When I was Andrew, I saw Thomas Becket being killed." She was again taken back, thinking, how does he know about Thomas Becket? Thomas Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1162 until 1170, when he was murdered by 4 knights in the Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170. How did Philip know of such an historical event? Philip explained to his auntie that when he was a little boy called Andrew, he was older than he is now and was 6 years of age. Andrew must have come from a family with money, as he claimed he was also able to write, which would have been very rare in those days. He said that for some reason he had left his home in Oxford to visit Canterbury and must have been amongst the congregation gathered for service on that fateful night in December 1170 and witnessed the assassination of Sir Thomas Becket. Philip then went on to describe that when they were in the city before entering the cathedral, he saw lots of soldiers wearing masks on their faces, walking around the city. The soldiers had large swords and their shields had drawings on them, and they were very noisy and shouting a lot. He said he was in the actual cathedral and heard him being murdered. He said that there were lots and lots of people in the church, where the men wore short dresses, which would have been tunics, while the women wore long dresses. Although he was only 6 years of age, he said he knew something very bad and serious was happening in the church. He said that he could not actually see Thomas Becket because there were too many tall people standing in front of him, but he knew that Thomas Becket had been killed. His Aunt Rosemary said that there was no way that a child as young as Philip would know anything about that famous event in history that had taken place hundreds of years before. Somehow, that historical event had left such a strong impression on a young 6-year-old boy named Andrew that 800 years later, the vivid images are still present in his incarnation as a young boy now called Philip Harding. George Neidhart. The following account of a previous life did not follow the typical pattern of hypnotic regression for George Neidhart. George was born in 1898 in Munich, Germany, and was brought up a Roman Catholic under a caring mother and a stern father, and between the ages of 5 and 7 had memories of previous lives, which he never experienced again until his 20s. When he left school, he started to learn his father's trade as a coppersmith, but at the start of World War I had to give up his apprenticeship at the age of 19 when he was called up for service in the German Imperial Navy, where he trained as a radio operator. George fortunately survived the war and was demobilised on January 1st, 1919. He returned to his home city of Munich amidst revolution and violence, where an economic depression was now setting in, and George was unable to return to his apprenticeship. He then married and had a daughter, but within 2 years his wife had died, and he was still under 25 years of age. George's views on life were now completely shattered, and his belief in the divine justice made praying a struggle. He had no place of his own to live, and a friend allowed him to live in his house. However, it was during this period that George had an experience that affected him deeply and was to transform his life. It happened one spring morning after he had just eaten his breakfast, when an amazing mixture of images appeared in his mind. But he was not disturbed in any way, and his senses and thoughts remained clear. The images in his mind appeared to be from another period in time centuries ago. The images were so overwhelming and strange that he immediately felt that he needed to write everything down. For the next 10 days and much sleeplessness, the images finally came to an end. What he had found was that the scenes and images appeared to be that of a former life, and the details of the various names, dates and places gave everything a sense of plausibility. He also felt that he was able to identify with the principal figure of the whole picture, and it felt like something had risen up deep from the deepest layers within him. He then made efforts to verify all that he had experienced from the images in his mind, and concluded that he had not fallen into a delusional state when he had experienced the mental images. The inner visions that he had experienced had referred to a previous existence for himself. He came to the conclusion that earthly existences can serve as a punishment inflicted on a person as an outward expression of repentance for wrongdoing, and can extend over many earthly existences. His memories started with the description of a castle around the year 1150, which he had sketched, where the castle stood on a mountain above jagged rocks. Entrance to the castle was via a wooden drawbridge across a deep moat that surrounded the mountain. He was not able to get the name of the castle in his visions, but felt it was near a highway that was much travelled in that period of time. He spent the next few years searching for the location in an attempt to verify details, with some success, and began exploring the region in search of his past life. From the town of Regen, he set off into the Bavarian forest, using only his intuition. He eventually came to an opening on the peak of a mountain, where he found himself standing in front of the ruins of a castle, which had been erected high above rocks. Only the tower remained standing. He then climbed to the top of the tower to see the view of the surrounding area. After a short search, he came upon the remains of a secret passage he had remembered. He later saw an engraving from 1726, at which time more of the main building still stood, and it matched exactly the sketch that he had drawn. He emerged from his experience with a different view of life and death, and had altered his view of life. Jeremy Anderson, James Hauser. Jeremy was born in Wacomus, Oklahoma, and at the age of 2 insisted that his name was not Jeremy but Jimmy. One day he was looking at a picture book with his grandmother and saw a picture of a truck, and said to her that it was a truck just like that in the picture that struck him and killed him. His grandmother said that Jeremy was extremely angry with the truck driver that had killed him. On another occasion, his grandfather Jack was lying in bed and resting a sore back, and Jeremy walked into the room and said, "What's up, Grandpa? Is your back killing you?" His grandfather replied, "Well, it's not killing me, but it's very sore." Jeremy then said, "Well, one time my back was really sore and it killed me." In 1967, 2 teenagers by the name of Jimmy Hauser, 14, and Kevin Lucas, 16, were driving a Buick sedan. Kevin, the supposed driver, was driving at a speed of 75 miles an hour when their car struck a truck at a rural intersection. The car then skidded about 99 feet before striking another truck before spinning another 108 feet. Although Kevin Lucas survived the accident with serious injuries, he had no memory of the accident, and Jimmy had been killed. James Hauser, or Jimmy, was buried at Tonkawa Cemetery about 90 miles from Jeremy's house. It turns out that Jimmy was the son of Nancy Anderson and the half-brother of Ron Anderson, who was Jeremy's father. James Anderson's gravestone reads August 11th, 1952 to August 12th, 1967. In April 1980, when Jeremy was 5 years old, he was taken to where the accident had taken place 13 years previously and got extremely emotional and described how he'd fallen out of the car. He said, "I was going like a bullet. It went like a bomb." The undertaker, who had overseen the damaged body of Jimmy, had described the type of injury normally sustained by the driver of the car and not the passenger. Jeremy Anderson had always claimed that he was the driver of the car and not Kevin. Robin Kline, and Tibetan student. When Robin was just 5 years of age, his mother noticed him making strange sounds, and after a period of time, his speech became more fluent, and he continued to utter the same strange sounds. Because Robin had made the sound so often, his mother was eventually able to make out what his son was actually saying and started to recognize them. One evening his parents were having a dinner party, and she discussed amongst the friends that her son regularly made strange sounds, as if they had meaning to him. One of the guests at the party offered to come into the nursery and listen to what her son was saying, and found that he was saying many strange sounding names. The guest asked the mother whether she could come back with someone who was an expert in languages, and 1 week later returned with a professor. The professor sat with the young man for 1 hour and said to his mother that the language being spoken by his son appears to be a dialect that came from northern Tibet. He recognized a few others, but many he did not recognize at all. The professor asked his mother whether the family had ever visited that region or whether any of their friends had spoken the language around the child. His mother replied no to both questions, and they went back to the nursery. The professor then asked Robin where he had learned the foreign words, and he replied, "In school." His mother then said, "But Robin, you've never been to school." Robin then replied, "When I went to school before." The professor then asked Robin, what did the school look like? Robin thought for a moment and said, "In the mountains." But then he said to his mother, "But not the sort of mountains we went to in summer." The professor then asked, was the school made of stone or wood? And Robin said, "What stone?" He was then asked what the teachers were like, and were they men or women? He said they were men, but they didn't dress like you or Daddy. They had skirts with a sash around their waist, that looked like a rope. Robin then gave a detailed description of the school he went to. The professor was so fascinated by what the young boy had told him that he decided to go to northern Tibet and seek out the school Robin had attended. He later wrote to the parents and said that the area their son had described was near China and was fairly accessible in eastern Tibet. He then said, "I have found the school your son described was in the Kwenlun Mountains. Rocky and arid and nothing like the mountains you visit in summer." He said it fitted Robin's description in detail, including the lamas who teach there. Dorothy Eady, and Benshrit High Priestess. Dorothy Louise Eady was born in London in 1904. At the age of 3, fell down a flight of stairs and seriously injured herself, where doctors initially declared her dead. However, she made an amazing recovery and then started exhibiting strange behaviours and asked that she be brought home and started to speak in a foreign language. At Sunday school, she started comparing Christianity with the ancient Egyptian religion and was expelled from a Dalit girls' school after she refused to sing a hymn calling on God to curse Egyptians. One day her parents took her to the British Museum and whilst looking at a photograph in one of the exhibit rooms, cried out, "There is my home, but where are the trees and the gardens?" What Dorothy was observing was a temple of Seti I, the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt, around 1290 BC. She then ran about the halls of the Egyptian rooms, kissing the statue's feet. After the first trip, she would regularly visit the British Museum, where she met a man by the name of E.A. Wallace Budge, who encouraged her in the study of hieroglyphs. After leaving school at 16, Eady became a part-time student at Plymouth Art School and began to collect Egyptian antiquities. In 1931, she moved to Egypt, and on arriving, she kissed the ground and announced she'd come home to stay. she married a teacher of English by the name of Imam Abdel Magwid. She would later report nighttime visitations by an apparition of Hor-Ra, who told her of a previous life as a young woman in ancient Egypt called Bentrishit, who had reincarnated in the person of Dorothy Eady. Bentrishit's mother sold vegetables and her father was a soldier during the reign of Seti I between 1290 BC to 1279 BC. At the age of 3, her mother died and she was sent to the temple of Kom el Sultan and was brought up to be a priestess. One day, Seti I visited her where they became lovers, and when she became pregnant, she told the high priest who the father was. The high priest told her that she had committed a serious offence, where she committed suicide rather than face trial. In 1935, and 2 years after her marriage ended to Imam Abdul Magwin, Dorothy went to live in Nazlat al-Saman, near the Giza pyramids, and met archaeologist Salim Hassan of the Department of Antiquities. He employed her as a secretary and draftswoman and was the department's first female employee to Hassan, and became valuable to other Egyptian scholars. Under her own name, she wrote articles and books and befriended many of the famous Egyptologists of the era. During this time, she prayed and made frequent offerings to the gods of ancient Egypt, and would often spend the night in the Great Pyramid. On the 3rd of March 1956, aged 52, she moved to Arabat Abydos, where she was given the name Seti, and made regular visits to the Temple of Seti, and had shown advanced knowledge of the temple. The chief inspector from the Antiquities Department decided to test her knowledge and asked her to stand at particular wall paintings in complete darkness, where she was instructed to identify them based on her prior knowledge as a temple priestess. She completed the task successfully, even though the painting locations had not yet been published at the time. For Dorothy, the Temple of Seti was a place of peace and security, and felt watched over by the ancient Egyptian gods. Dorothy Eady, or Seti as she was now known, claimed that in her past life as Bentrishit, the temple had a garden where she had first met Seti I. These were the same gardens that she described as a young girl living in London that were not believed by her parents. While she was living in Abydos, the gardens she had described in her previous life as a temple priestess was discovered by excavators, and the garden matched her descriptions. Dorothy turned one of the temple rooms into a personal office and described the Temple of Seti as like entering a time machine where the past becomes the present and the modern mind has difficulty understanding a world in which magic is accepted. Dorothy wrote and detailed many modern practices from ancient times in short articles written between 1969 and 1975 and were edited and published. At the age of 60 in 1964, she began work as a part-time consultant for the Antiquities Department, guiding tourists around the Temple of Seti and explaining the symbolism of the painted wall scenes. On the 21st of April 1981, Dorothy Eady, or Seti, died in Abydos and was buried in an unmarked grave facing the west in the desert outside a Coptic cemetery.